I'm sure that everyone here will agree that we've seen in recent years an impressive and unprecedented role for the public interest advocacy community in Washington and around the country. Among the many young and energetic and new voices involved in this process stands out not a bit less energetic and not a bit less influential our next guest, whom I dare call the elder statesman of the fight for consumer and citizen rights over our nation's telecommunications networks. For let's just say many years, Gene Kimmelman has been at the forefront of the promotion of consumer and citizen rights. At Public Citizen, at the Consumer Federation of America, as counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and most recently as vice president at Consumers Union. Gene was the lead consumer advocate during the federal government's consideration of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and has since been the consumer's lead voice on media and telecommunications issues for quite some time. So it is our honor that he agreed to speak about the utility of this project of ours today. Gene, please.
Thank you, Amit. It's nice to be the old man sometimes. Commissioner Adelstein laid out the important policies that need to be addressed that are touched on in this book, and we thank him for his leadership in bringing us to a point where we even have the possibility of talking about these policies. He's looking forward. I want to look backwards a little bit. The work of scholarship that you have before you in this book is extremely thoughtful, very creative, but most importantly, provocative. It calls for a thorough revamping of U.S. policies. It calls for extensive public intervention in the telecommunications and media marketplace. It calls for extensive public investment in this sector, and it calls for unheard of, extensive public involvement in this market. Now, these kind of ideas have been impossible and really unheard of in recent past. But is it now possible or even likely that they have traction? I think so. And a little bit of a look at history and what we're experiencing today, I think, tells you why they have traction. The compilation is framed as offering a second chance, if you look at the preface. Now, why is it suggesting the idea of starting over in this tremendous sector that has grown enormously in recent past? And why is it suggesting redoing anything? Well, I think if you look at what we've all just experienced in the 2008 implosion of our financial markets with lax oversight and overzealous deregulation, which is leading to today's recession, possibly global depression, you look carefully at that and you'll see many years, more than a decade, of telecommunications and media policy gone awry. During this time, quality journalism has been consistently eroding at the hands of corporate takeover, short-term profit maximization, de-emphasizing quality and long-term journalistic goals. This is a bit like the securitization of subprime garbage loans with good mortgages, mixing them all together to a point where you can't find the good from the bad anymore, and we're talking about nationalizing banks and creating a special bank for bad loans. How are we going to separate good journalism from bad journalism with what has happened in the corporatization of media in this country? Something important needs to be done. We've experienced an explosion of telecommunications competition. Some of you may recall the breakup of the Bell system, the idea of local companies competing against each other, the explosion of long-distance competition, the development of the internet, digital devices, new services, equipment competition. all virtually destroyed in the last decade through consolidation and an almost anesthetization of our intellectual property creativity through bundling, overuse of copyright protections, leaving us out of a world of immense competitive opportunity, tight oligopolies for transmission of the most important communication services in our society. It's a little bit like overzealous credit default swaps to have allowed all the consolidation, lax antitrust oversight and regulatory supervision. And then we have the enormous benefit of spectrum, the tremendous opportunity for competition through wireless, consistently minimized by allowing dominant wireline providers to gobble up the vast majority of the potentially competitive alternative to their business. The unraveling of cable regulations, leaving consumers paying ever-increasing prices, the failure of competition despite the advent of satellite, a market where consumers are simply ripped off day in and day out. And then, most importantly, we've opened the door to discrimination on the most important and innovative communications platform of the 21st century, the Internet, through inappropriate elimination of non-discrimination rules for digital subscriber line services, cable modem service, all high-speed services, services that really are the new basic telecommunications service of the 21st century that had always been subject to fairness, non-discrimination, common carriage. The disregard for minority ownership, the failure to meet community media needs, failing to protect those most vulnerable to marketing abuses through disinvestment in public media and public oversight, just like in the financial sector. It is these failures that require, I think, a second chance, a starting over, as this book indicates, to serve the public interest in the next decade. And it is these failures, in conjunction with the American people's rekindled awareness of the need to expand public investment and public accountability in the wake of this market meltdown, that makes many of these proposals eminently doable. Makes many of them presented in this book ripe for public policy intervention. And I believe advocates whom I work with, certainly I, look forward to carrying forward the ideas presented in these books and bringing them to fruition in public policy. So I commend the authors. Your good scholarship, your great research will be put to good use, and it comes at the perfect moment in an administration that is very open to these ideas. So thank you for your work, and I look forward with the rest of us to hearing the details of what your research demonstrates. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene, very much. Okay, and now for the authors themselves. We will have two panels, as the program promises. I'd like to invite the first panel to come sit at the table here. Marvin Amori of the University of Nebraska Law School, Richard Taylor of Penn State, Sharon Strover of the University of Texas at Austin, and Heather Hudson of the University of San Francisco. As you can see, we definitely spread ourselves all over. The order of the day will be as following. Each of the authors will get a bottle of water, and afterwards we'll address this audience for about a number of minutes that they know. You don't. I will be using the stopper on my iPhone to stop you. When the time comes, I will give you 3-minute and 1-minute warnings with my cards. And afterwards, we'll open it for Q&A. Then we'll have our second panel, and we'll open that for Q&A. If you've taken your lunch when you came in, you're free to have it whenever you want. Without further ado, as they say, Marvin, please.
Thank you. All right, I'm Marvin Amori.
Oh, by the way, you should also have these microphones, because these are for the room. So just pass them
Thank you.
Should we stand or up or?
Up to you.
Okay. I typed out my comments because there's a minute limitation that Amit gave me, and he scared me. So forgive me for reading. So I'm Marvin Amori, a law professor at the University of Nebraska, where I help direct the program in space and telecom law. I also served as general counsel of a leading media reform organization called Free Press. So in this book, I wrote a chapter on broadband investment and competition. The topic of investment in broadband has recently become hot, even outside of DC telecom circles. For example, the moving stimulus bill contains $6 billion for investing in broadband in rural areas. The topic of investment and competition in broadband has been hot within our geeky telecom circles for many years now. We know that the United States has fallen behind many of our global competitors when it comes to competition, value, and speeds and deployment of broadband. The US is fairly famously 22nd in the world in deployment, and in Japan, almost all citizens can buy connections that are 20 times the speed of the average US connection and often 100 times faster on the upload for a fraction of the price. So when I think of broadband problems, and I discuss them in the chapter, I think of sort of three problems: a rural problem of consumers not having access to broadband, an urban problem that our networks in New York aren't as good as the networks in, say, Tokyo or Paris or other major cities, and also just the value problem everywhere of Americans paying too much for too little. So let's ask, how did we get here? How do we solve this problem? So there's two main questions. But first, I want to talk actually most here about, does it even matter? And by this point, we've heard broadband does matter. It's central to our economy. Broadband can support new jobs for fiber deployment because of its multiplier effects. Broadband is a general purpose technology that can be used for many different business uses. Real economic growth is based on innovation, and an open internet has been the greatest engine of innovation we've ever seen. I also want to talk about the importance of broadband to democracy, to understand the political stakes of this issue. So I think we all understand that without the internet, Barack Obama would not be the president. Right? If he ran against Hillary without the internet many years ago, the mass media would have treated him like a long shot candidate. His candidacy would have been killed through conventional wisdom. He wouldn't have raised millions from small contributors. His own site, myBarackObama.com, wouldn't have been there to organize millions for house parties, to organize caucus dates, which he swept, to spread the message in his own words and in his own speeches, to counter inaccurate attacks, to have that call your neighbor tool, to let people like me create things like young telecom lawyers for Obama. And later on election day, we know that the people who use the internet most, those under 30, voted for Obama overwhelmingly, 70%. Right? And in fact, I saw an article yesterday. All of the candidates for chairman of the Republican National Committee are running a campaign promising to upgrade the technology of the RNC. They understand that technology hurt them in this election. And so what the internet does is it informs people. It's the friend of politicians who want an informed and engaged public that are participatory. Some politicians benefit from an informed public and have incentives to increase, say, broadband deployment, etc., while other politicians probably don't as much. So not only did the internet help Barack Obama become president, but we all know that it'll be central to his governance. Right? His first day, he issued an open government directive. Right? People who have access to the internet and broadband will be able to access all these, all this information online. And to take on big entrenched interests, you need the public informed and on your side. Okay? And I've seen this, the public being informed when it comes to Free Press's work on net neutrality and SaveTheInternet.com. And we know that to serve big interests, you can do things like have secret meetings with oil executives, stamp confidential on everything, have a man-sized safe in your office, classify things. That's how you work when you have big interests on your side. So how did we get here? You might find this hard to believe. Gene spoke about it for a little bit, but our telecom policies for the last 8 years haven't been very good. The previous administration had no broadband strategy. Afterwards, the administration, through an executive agency called the NTIA, claimed that it had a strategy, deregulation, the same one that worked so well in the financial markets. And the NTIA concluded that deregulation had worked. And the idea for the last 8 years was let the phone and cable carriers do whatever they want, pass whatever laws and rules that they want. Carriers wanted to eliminate competition among ISPs. They got that. They were hoping to eliminate competition to some extent over app providers and content providers, but they weren't able to they were unable to eliminate net neutrality. So, despite Adelstein's wonderful dissents, the Bush administration made a series of bad mistakes on broadband, as Gene Kimmelman mentioned. So, how do we solve the problem now? How do we ensure that all Americans have access to competitive, high-speed internet connections? And I make a range of proposals in the chapter, from subsidies to spectrum reform, and how to ensure wireline competition. In short, I argue the first thing we do is we reverse the policies of the Bush administration, put every policy tool on the table. Under Bush, we abandoned what a lot of other successful countries have used, non-discrimination and competition. The argument is that common carriage, which worked well for 70 years, is outdated. It's quaint, kind of like the Geneva Convention. But we're reversing bad policies, and we should reverse this one. We're no longer torturing people or locking them up in Gitmo or denying global warming exists. The list goes on, and we're making a clean break with all of that, including the terrible telecom policy. So we need to ensure competition. We need to ensure that carriers don't undermine competition in vertical markets, in applications and content, nor in competition for providing internet service. And beyond reversing the old policies and joining the international community, I make a range of proposals in this wonderful, beautiful book, including gathering information, just a whole range. I look forward to your feedback on it, but I am done. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Richard Taylor. I have the pleasure of being with Amit Schechter, co-director of the Institute for Information Policy at Penn State. I also wish to thank the host, the New America Foundation, and the Media Democracy Fund, our sponsor, who supported us in this undertaking. I was assigned the topic of cable television, and I start my chapter with a quote. It says, "The revolution now in sight may be nothing less than either of those, the book and the telephone. It may conceivably be even more." Now, you might think I'm talking about something current, but this was from On the Cable, the Television of Abundance, the report of the Sloan Commission in 1971. I follow that with a second quote some of you may recognize. "Man came by to hook up my cable TV. We settled in for the night, my baby and me. We switched round and round till 1:30 dawn. There was 57 channels and nothing on." So you can go from the high hopes for cable TV when it started to, in its maturity as primarily, and with all due respect to C-SPAN, an entertainment medium. So how you feel about that sort of depends on your personal perspective on the public use of telecommunications media. But now the era of cable television as we have known it is ending, and so I titled my chapter, Managing the Transition to Broadband. This is a second chance to shape a new medium as cable migrates to broadband, and my paper argues that this is a good thing. Classic cable TV was really too different, but intertwined technologies, transmission and transportation medium combined with content. And in recent years, they've added, of course, digital content and access to the internet and IP-based applications, which are starting to consume much of the capacity of the cable systems as they move there. So there's many topics that could be covered. There's a number covered in the chapter that I'm not going to be able to address even briefly. There's even more not in the chapter. I believe I started, Amit may recall, with 42 topics, and he said, no, maybe you could just cut that down a little bit for cable regulation. So I'm going to cover a half dozen very quickly. That are just mentioned in the book, and so that you can pursue them if you want. The first is the transformation of the technology from the analog to the digital and the IP-based technologies, and the challenges, the technical challenges this presents, but also the legal and regulatory challenges as you move from a regime under the Cable Act to a regime under what exactly if it's all broadband, and so the challenges that that presents. The second is the migration of content to the internet, what's called TV 2.0, of which things like Hulu and Juiced are just the tip of the iceberg of a huge amount of video, a huge and increasing amount of video that is being provided on cable, which represents a real sort of strategic threat to the vision of the cable industry and the affiliated content producers and distributors as well. It's a disruptive technology, and it seriously threatens the status quo and is likely to get a pretty strong response in that respect. Looking ahead in the long run, the paper suggests that congressional intervention is going to be required sooner or later in creation of a new sort of broadband cross-platform regime which sort of stabilizes and solves this problem of many different silos. In the short term, it suggests that the Federal Communications Commission adopt policies that promote this migration to an IP-based network, and so perhaps setting just as they did for digital TV, a date for conversion to IP, to require all TVs, as they did with UHF, to be able to accept internet-type inputs, and remotes and tuners to do likewise, to have standards, open standards for internet video, and to take other actions that would encourage this process. The third is with respect to the franchising authority, and I know it makes many people unhappy, but if we're going to an all broadband world under a uniform regime, I think you have to move the authority from the local franchising authority to the states and create state video franchises, which in time will become state broadband franchises, and essentially have the greater part of the regulation be federal and state. At the same time, the fifth is to maintain, sustain, and enhance, if possible, the traditional roles that come under PEG channels, public, educational, and governmental channels, not just in funding and support, but also in quality and ability to deliver to their audiences that which they have traditionally delivered as a valuable public service. And that can easily get lost because it's a real challenge for those groups who are often underfinanced to deal with the movement to an IP regime. And the sixth, just one other topic, is the idea of the adoption of metered services. And I spend a little bit of time on that, as it is now an idea which is becoming very popular. We want to get rid of those bandwidth hogs, and why should Aunt Minnie, who only sends 2 emails a month, pay for people who are downloading video games and HD TV programs all the time? I understand that there are real costs associated with providing bandwidth. I mean, and they can identify those costs. But there seems to be no connection between those costs and some of the proposals that we've seen. And so I think there's enormous potential for anti-competitive use of bandwidth caps as the video migrates. Cisco put forth a study that said the average household could be using 1.1 terabytes of data by 2010, which under the plan initially put forward by Tom Warner for a bandwidth cap would result in an annual bill of a little over $1,100, a monthly use of 1.1 terabytes, and a monthly bill of over $1,100 per household. So that has to be watched pretty closely. So those are some of the things. I then outline some of the future things, and then that will be emerging issues, and close with one other quote. An impressive new instrument of communication has been made available to society by the advance of technology. It remains for society to employ that instrument wisely and well. And that was also from the 1971 Sloan Commission. So we do indeed have a second chance. Thank you.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I do want to say to Amit and my co-authors that it's been a great experience working on this endeavor. As I was sitting here thinking about broadband in rural areas, the chapter that I addressed, I was recalling that I made what I think will be a last research trip to a county in Texas that I've been studying 5-year USDA-funded study, actually, called Zapata County. And on this particular trip, I went to interview a small business owner. This was a woman who was starting a T-shirt shop, and she was using the internet in order to sell her T-shirts outside of the local area. And she was quite surprised at how much this had already helped her local business. Zapata is one of the poorest counties in a state that has a lot of very poor counties. Unemployment's extraordinarily high, and this was a bright spot and a striking illustration of what telecommunications could mean to a small business owner. A couple doors down was a workforce commission that made its high-speed computers available to people who were taking distance education classes. The closest community college was about a 2-hour drive away, and this was the only way a lot of students could begin to get an advanced education. These were some of the very striking examples in a poor town with a lot of unpaved streets that had only recently gotten a sewer system. These were some of the bright spots that really illustrated the significance of telecommunications and broadband in particular in a rural region. Rural regions have been left behind in the telecommunications network era in this country. In terms of our movement toward a more market-based service delivery model in telecommunications, the rural areas have really gotten only a trickle of the broadly available and widely used telecommunications and internet innovations that people in this room are probably pretty used to. E-rate and the high-cost fund programs of universal service have helped, as have some RUS programs, but they've been too small, and they've been administered without binding regulatory rules, without good assessments, and really without precision in terms of targeting and understanding where the money is being spent. It's time for the trickle-down approach to stop and to reintegrate rural populations and economies into a broadly upgraded environment where the benefits of broadband for education, health, and work can be shared equally. And I argue that both demand and supply initiatives are needed. By way of quick background, there are about 54 million people in areas that are considered rural, although that definition of what is rural varies a lot. That's about 17% of U.S. households in these areas. Small businesses are predominant in these regions, and of course the population has a lot lower income compared to urban populations. About 39% of rural households now have access to broadband, and depending on whose statistics you believe, that's anywhere from 11 to 20% fewer households than have broadband in urban areas. And one very striking feature of that internet topography is that they generally face very little competition. If there is a provider there, there's only one provider, quite typically. They often pay higher prices for services as well. Among those who do have access to broadband in rural areas, statistics illustrate that they use the internet less, and they often use the internet for less sophisticated or perhaps less productivity-oriented applications than we might be used to seeing in urban areas. Which I think speaks to the fact that in rural areas, we simply don't see the access to technical expertise, and we don't see the level of access to digital literacy and literacy training that exists in more urban areas. So let me just highlight a few recommendations. On the supply side, of course, build out networks to unserved areas and improve networks that exist in underserved areas. From the perspective of, I think, all of my co-authors, this is fundamentally an economic stimulus initiative. More network capabilities will bring improved economic opportunities over the long haul. They also mean huge efficiencies in a lot of fundamental service areas, including education, but also including health and including government. And governments in a lot of rural areas are just beginning to discover what you can do with computers and networks. And this needs to be pushed along. in order for those governments to join the movement towards more transparency, that a lot of the new technologies and network capabilities are beginning to allow us all to participate in. Tax incentives and subsidy programs can certainly assist in the build-out, but they need to be targeted and they need to be audited. No more high-cost funds without clear links between that investment and tangible improvement in the regions that they are supposed to be targeting. Connectivity needs to be provided not simply by handing funds to incumbent providers, but rather by considering technological alternatives and making decisions based on what's best for the locality. For example, by exploiting wireless capabilities as well as wireline capabilities. In that spirit, all kinds of institutional partnerships and arrangements should be allowed to take the initiative in order to help broadband take root in these regions. People should be from NGOs, from all sorts of nonprofits, from the public sector as well as from the private sector, should be allowed to build, evaluate, and use broadband. In small markets that lack competition and scale, local institutions can band together to create systems that make sense for businesses and citizens and local institutions. Recently passed legislation such as the Broadband Data Improvement Act is a start, or it would be if it were funded. But that act acknowledges the spirit of alternative technologies in that it proposes to gather data from VoIP and from phone providers that are allowing people to use their phone systems in order to use the internet. That's a first step. On the demand side, very briefly, what we see in rural areas is strong interest in broadband capabilities, but very limited access to technical expertise. So we really need to implement programs to grow that technical expertise. That includes digital literacy programs for all ages in rural communities using a variety of providers. This is a critical investment that needs to be funded as quickly as possible. Businesses in particular need to be educated on how to exploit the capabilities of broadband in order to improve their productivity. Community colleges should be tapped for the sorts of trainings that they're already very good at providing. And we need to think of those as rooted, local, trusted institutions with good relationships in their communities to enhance training. Leadership, my final point, in rural areas really could use a boost, and I think now is the time to enhance leadership opportunities by creating, I call them rural leadership academies, by creating structures that can grow local people into leadership roles by allowing them to get access to the education on infrastructure issues and on political and governance issues as well. Only by growing a kind of stable base of rural leaders can we begin to look toward a future for rural areas in which there'll be a steady supply of people who will make the most out of these opportunities. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Heather Hudson. I'm from the University of San Francisco, and as I was sitting there, I was thinking there's kind of a hidden Stanford connection among several authors on this panel. We first learned to apply social sciences to communication policy in graduate school, but that's a story for another day. What I want to talk about is the universal service support for public access and social services, which has been known by the shorthand of the E-rate program. And I just wanted to give a little background, although it's familiar to many people in this room, or most, I think. The Telecom Act of 1996 expanded the definition of universal service to include advanced services and organizations and institutions as well as individuals, which was really quite new. And under that rubric, schools, libraries, and rural health care centers. And at that time, it was part of a strategy to bridge what was the so-called digital divide, and also to apply communication to education and health care. Today, I think we're concerned with bridging the broadband divide, including the urban and rural disparities, as we just heard from Sharon, and income and other disparities as well that linger on. So far, the E-rate has allocated about $2.25 billion per year for schools and libraries. It is administered through the FCC and an organization, Universal Service Administrative Company, under the FCC, but by the FCC. It has some interesting features that I think are worth continuing. It provides discounts based on economic need and rurality for schools and libraries. Those discounts range from a minimum of 20% to 90% for the poorest schools and libraries, whether they're in rural or urban areas. Talk about economic stimulus. Since 1997, about $21.1 billion has been allocated for schools and libraries. And in terms of targeting the low income, I think it's done quite well. 34.5% has gone to schools and libraries eligible for the maximum 90% discount, and 87%, about 80% to those eligible for 60% or more. There are some very interesting features of this program which I think are well worth continuing and putting in a larger context that I want to come back to. As I mentioned, it supports institutional versus individual access. It provides subsidies to the end users, which could be schools or libraries or rural health centers. Those subsidies are targeted. It provides incentives to extend infrastructure, and I want to also mention that again, to others in the community using the schools or libraries as anchor tenants. And recently it's using health networks to extend broadband. And these are features I think that are well worth continuing here, but for those of you who have some international interest, they're highly unusual in universal service policies throughout the world. I would like to say unique, but that might be stretching it. But in the rural health care program, the funding amount initially was quite small and underutilized. So in a couple of years ago, the FCC took on its own kind of rural broadband stimulus pilot project, I would say, and allocated $417 million for 69 broadband telehealth networks, which are just now being built out. And the intent there was not only to improve rural infrastructure for health care, but also make that infrastructure available for disaster preparedness, emergency response, which have been certainly priorities in recent years, and the facilitation of an electronic medical records network, which I also want to come back to. So thinking about the policy recommendations that come out of the E-rate itself, I believe the E-rate should remain at the FCC with the economists and with the lawyers. Although many educators and community activists are a little skeptical of that. But I think we really need an advisory committee or committees with membership from other government agencies such as NTIA, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, RUS, perhaps security, and other professionals in those fields, education, health and library services, community outreach. And I was very pleased at the Commissioner's comments about openness and discussion and participation, because I think that could enrich this and other programs. I think that the Universal Service Fund should be limited to connectivity rather than other applications. I'll come back to that in a minute. And that the discount program that emphasizes poverty and rurality should be maintained, but perhaps could be fine-tuned and perhaps focused on those that really deserve the maximum subsidy. And the competitive bidding, which is also a very unusual feature of the U.S. Universal Service Program, where the users, once they are certified, go out for competitive bids, I think that should also be maintained. In terms of making it work a bit better, perhaps a triennial review or another review mechanism should be put in place to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, and transparency of disbursement of these funds, and I'm thinking ahead to what other funding programs there might be. We also, however, need to think beyond access. The E-rate funds connectivity, and it's my view that that's the role of this fund, but we have to realize that there are requirements for other functions, some call them digital literacy, increasing capacity, training of teachers, training of people to use these new tools, and development of content that really makes them most effective. And I believe that there's still need for funding for that, and that the government should be thinking about other pockets and involving other agencies that could complement the connectivity support that has come from the universal service mechanisms. And putting on an outreach hat, I think a very small percentage of these funds should be used for outreach and in terms of any new programs as well. because some are still aware of the programs who are eligible and how to participate, excuse me, and a small amount of funding for evaluation to update and evaluate how these funds are being used. I want to use my last moments to say that the E-rate, however, needs to be thought of in a broader context. It needs to be part of a national broadband strategy. We need an overall national policy with targets, as Amit mentioned earlier, that includes infrastructure of connectivity, also for health information systems, improved productivity, smart energy, as we've heard mentioned in the past week. We need to coordinate all these funding. I realize there are stimulus proposals out there. There are other proposals for infrastructure funding, broadband funding. I'm not seeing the coordination of those. I think we need to make sure that they're all coordinated, and the E-rate is seen as, and other universal service programs and FCC programs, as really part of this strategy, whether it includes NTIA, RUS, Health and Human Services, and others. We need to be sure that these programs are technology neutral, as we've heard before, not specifying wireless versus wireline or cable or mobile versus fixed. We heard from our most internet savvy user, perhaps. I think those distinctions don't make sense to users anymore, so I don't think we should use them either. We should use incentives such as targeted subsidies and remember digital literacy. And finally, just as part of that strategy, we need to adopt or expand some of the E-rate strategies to this larger national program, I think. Subsidies to institutional as opposed to individual users, subsidies to users rather than just providers. Allowing schools and libraries to be anchor tenants for outreach to their communities, such as was done, some might remember, in Alaska with a special waiver from the Commission to serve whole villages. Good national model. Expand rural health care networks to all rural clinics, including nonprofit but also for-profit. They're all out there trying to serve rural areas, as part of a strategy to implement the National Health Information Network and electronic record system, and expand evaluation and outreach so that we can track how the money is being spent and, most importantly, what difference it makes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You see a disciplined group, year of training, and everybody's delivering everything on time. So this gives us time for questions. I'm now going to have to train the audience for some discipline. I've been asked to say that, and I think it's the right way, keep questions short so that we can have our answers here. And please say who you are so that the microphones can catch that. Thank you.
For Ms. Strober, my name is Glenn Strong. I'm representing TechSoup, but I work overseas in Eastern Europe, building wireless networks paid for by USAID, with the understanding that we're serving the rural locations. That's what we're doing. When you go to a country like Macedonia, Albania, the cities of Tirana or Skopje have that connectivity. But the goal of aid is to include the rural populations and to do many of the things that Ms. Hudson spoke about, that you spoke about. So we have that understanding that when you're working overseas on the West Bank or you're working in Senegal, that you need to be all-inclusive, that you need to deal with the monopolistic providers. And so USAID policy governs many of those things. But I come back to America trying to work in broadband policy and in rural areas. You find that there's just, it's so controlled, just as you said. So I wanted to thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Okay. Questions? Yes, please.
My name is Mark McCarthy. I'm with Georgetown University. I have a question about content and the new communications policy.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes.
I'll speak louder.
We can give a light.
Okay.
Pass the wireless mic here. And if you could pass down here the wireless mic, that's by Heather. That will help people.
Does that work better? Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's power.
Wireless.
Wireless. I'm with Georgetown University as Mark McCarthy. The question I've got is about content. The old communication regime, where everybody was divided up into telephone, broadcasting, cable, had a lot of faults, siloed and so on. But at least it provided for some measure of the production of timely and relevant information that people needed. The news function had a place in the regime, and it had a reasonably stable source of funding to produce it. I think by any measure, that function is getting worse. Gene made reference to that with his comment about the decline of journalism. And the question for policy is there something that needs to be done to help reverse that? We've been focused on the introduction of competition in the distribution world, and I think we've sort of assumed that will take care of the problem, but it may be that that's not enough, or it may even undermine the source of revenue for this kind of function. I mean, think of Craigslist as a great thing, but it's also undermining the advertising base for the local newspapers. You know, we're beginning to see, you know, foundations jumping into this, providing money for the nonprofit world to cover essential news gathering functions for local jurisdictions. Is there a policy issue here, and if so, what should we do about that?
Okay. I mean, I want to say that in the second panel, I think that Ellen Goodman, when we'll talk about public media, will address probably this issue, or could address this issue as well, but probably, Richard, do you want to pick this up here? Here you go.
While the issue of news gathering and more broadly journalism is not covered in my paper, I'll take a quick shot at it. Obviously, print journalism is in trouble, and that's a symbol or signifies that the whole idea of what journalism is has been brought into question by the internet. And that's a long conversation. We're trying to adapt to that, but certainly there will be no lack of information sources, although credibility is a big problem. More specifically, what I'm seeing, and I teach a course on electronic publishing, is creative responses to that from cable systems, broadcasters, and newspapers. Broadcasters going back to their, they are actually franchised to serve their local community, or licensed, and some, you know, not just deliver network programming from other places. And so I'm seeing, to the extent that you're looking for professional journalism with reporters going out with kits that include cameras and so forth, newspapers posting video on their websites, broadcasters and cable news channels relying on information from pooled sources of reporting that produce new local sources which are made available through traditional media, but primarily also on the internet. So you still have local news and information and diversity. The advertising model, as you said with Craigslist, you know, Google is sort of sucking through Google all of the advertising revenues out of everything, and that's going to be a problem that's going to require some new models. But I have seen new ways of addressing issues of local news gathering and reporting.
Yes. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Kerry Hinton. I'm with the DC Public Service Commission. The two keynote speakers that we had to start off with, as well as I believe one or two of the panelists, had mentioned the issue of affordability or increasing demand. Much of the debate that we've heard in the last few weeks, particularly relevant to the economic stimulus package, has focused on availability, building out broadband networks to rural areas. Of course, one of the speakers here addressed that in more detail. But affordability and demand have, shall we say, been the simple sister in this debate. One of our concerns at our commission is specifically availability and affordability of broadband services, particularly for low-income users or potential users in urban areas, although it is also applicable to rural areas. I'd like the panel to address affordability, whether it be urban or rural areas. And secondly, in relationship to that is the technology issue. The current programs that the FCC has in place, as well as many of the states, including the DC Commission, affordability is oriented towards communication services that are provided by the incumbent LECs primarily, in some cases CLECs. But few of those programs, and particularly the federal program, have extended to broadband services or voice services provided by cable systems or by other platforms. So I'd appreciate comments on both of those points.
Okay.
Well, you're absolutely right that affordability is a critical issue. It's a critical issue in inner cities as well as in rural areas, and in both cases the populations generally have lower incomes on which to draw. What we suggest is that, what I suggest, yes, and some of my colleagues, I think, join in sharing this perspective, that we need to bring the costs of those services down, and there may be ways to deliver broadband much more cost effectively than is currently the case. In particular, there's been little scrutiny of the high cost fund, and it may indeed be the case that some of the money currently going to the high cost fund could be redirected towards other technological systems that would be more efficient and effective at delivering broadband and at lower costs as well. By advocating for technological neutrality, we would hope that there would be new incentive for different kinds of service providers to jump in to provide services, and that some of those services would indeed be at lower costs. We also look to the model of other countries and see, as our first speaker pointed out, much faster service at dramatically lower costs. And I think we need to very squarely put the question to our incumbents right now: why can't we have that? Nobody has really answered that kind of question.
Can I ask that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your point is very well taken. There's a couple of things to think. Affordability is really critical. One is using the schools and libraries not only as public access points for people to come and use them, whether they're students or community members, but as hubs for wireless networks to serve neighborhoods or towns or other parts of cities. Another point is to think about something I didn't address because I focused on the institutional funding, but the Lifeline and Link Up programs, which are subsidies for basic phone service, really could be expanded. Lifeline, which subsidizes basic phone service, certainly could be used for any kind of voice service, cellular as well as fixed, because the technology shouldn't matter, but perhaps a program to subsidize or provide low-cost loans for computers. There's other possibilities. Link Up, which also provides a way of providing basic connectivity in high-cost areas, could be expanded or changed into a broadband voucher program, almost like food stamps. So if you qualify, you get a voucher worth X dollars a month that you can use with any provider, because the problem is we're still very dependent on individual providers who will give you 10 reasons why we can't do what's being done in country X, and I think we really need to get past that. So your point is well taken, and I think there are some strategies we could use to push on that.
Even though, although it's not written in, I don't think, any of our chapters, but there was lively conversation around really radically upturning universal service and making it grants that are in the hands of the consumers, rather than focus on providers, focus on consumers directly, and allow them to choose the services they want.
It's in Krishna Jayakar's chapter on universal service. Marvin, go ahead, answer. You wanted to add something about cost.
Thanks. So I think in rural areas, the cost is high, so the prices are going to be higher, and the way to solve that is often through subsidy. And I think the right way to go is to subsidize broadband connections rather than voice. Everyone's been making that proposal, and especially to subsidize, highly scalable infrastructure, things like fiber. Although we always say technologically neutral, fiber seems to be more scalable. When it comes to urban areas, the prices are high, not quite because of cost. The costs are a lot lower. Likely the prices are so high for consumers because of a lack of competition and a lack of targeted regulation to handle the lack of competition. And we see in most markets that are not competitive, you have high prices. Think of the special access market, the local access market. And what we need to do is we need to actually find ways to promote competition so that our prices in big cities decrease. And so, we've seen numbers on price per megabit per second, and ours are, I think, 10, 13 times higher than they are in Japan. Right? And so if we were getting the same kind of value, a lot of the people who don't subscribe to broadband because they don't see value in it will subscribe, and on top of it, there won't be a wealth transfer from consumers, including poor consumers, to concentrated duopolistic carriers.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that to add to the answers here, that in Marvin's chapter on the wireline industry, there's quite detailed recommendations to enhance competition, which is, I heard, was designed in order to lower prices, among other things. At least when I was studying economics, that was the case.
Can I make a point about you?
About me, no, please don't. And go ahead.
If you don't mind. So the first question had to do with USAID funding rural broadband in Eastern Europe. And there's an analog to some extent when it comes to competition in wireline markets. You know, in the 90s, through the WTO and the Basic Telecoms Agreement, the US was pushing for competitive wireline markets abroad all over the world. And the US pushed very hard to open up markets abroad to competition. Meanwhile, countries abroad did that. Meanwhile, at home, we were closing our markets to competition. Competition from new entrants, competition from foreign companies. I know that Amit, in a former world, helped one of our incumbents try to break into to become a competitive carrier in other markets around the world. And so we see the same sort of two-sided arguments from the incumbents. Open up markets abroad. Well, essentially, they're so powerful here that the policies we know work abroad aren't being implemented here, both on the rural wireless side and on the wireline competition side.
And the other point I want to add to that is that in the chapter devoted to universal service, Krishna Jayakar, who couldn't be with us today from Penn State, offers a new vision of universal service that is more consumer-based and value to consumer-based, and again, not connectivity-based the same way we looked at it so far. Please.
I've been asked to wait for the mic, but my question is for Professor
Taylor.
My name is Jerry Letter. I'm with Miller and Van Eaton. We represent local government, so I'll put my bona fides right on the table. I'm intrigued. I saw the chart that was out on the internet. I haven't read the whole chapter, but I heard that you repeated today that you think that local franchising is one of the stalling factors for broadband deployment. And if I've stated that wrong, please correct me. I was just going to ask you, have you done any research in those states in which the state has taken over the franchising process to document that broadband and choice is more prevalent in those states than states where it's not? And if you're looking for states, I would suggest your own state of Pennsylvania, here in Maryland, New York, where a very, very engaged company is doing local franchising on almost a one per day basis, as opposed to some of the other states where they've had state franchising in place for almost 3 years and still not a lot of service. And then the follow-up on that is not only how many folks have choice, but in those states where the state has taken over franchising, have you measured the impact on community programming with the loss of support at the state legislature for public education and governmental channels, and in some states where those channels will disappear in the year 2012? I was wondering if that's in the rest of the book. It wasn't in the chart, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
I'm sorry, which firm are you with?
Miller and Van Eaton.
Yes, and I actually, as you may have noted if you looked at the footnotes, used the resources on the website of your firm as the source of my information. And I do note the study that you did, or you have posted there, or you can link to from there. So I commend the Miller and Van Eaton website to people who are concerned about this particular issue. And the study that's there points out, sort of answers his question, which is no, there isn't any current research on the short term of showing definitively positive impacts of the transfer from local franchising authorities to states. And if I misstated, clear me.
Professor, my whole life I wanted to do this to a professor.
Thank you.
Then if there's no research, what are you basing your declaratory statements that local franchising ought to be taken down? When there's research to the contrary.
I wouldn't describe your study as research to the contrary, and maybe that's a sidebar conversation. Yes, I mean, it shows the absence of information about something. It doesn't show negative information, if I remember. Let's not do that, okay? With that study, I'll be happy to talk to you, believe me. This is something I worry about, and what I was asked to do was make both short-term and long-term recommendations. And as I see, I'll just tell you my opinion, and you're certainly welcome to yours. The migration, cable systems, there will be, I think, at some point in the not terribly distant future between 2010 and 2020, no cable systems under the Cable Act, right? They're all going to be IP-based, whatever the FCC or Congress decides to call them at that point. And there will be a uniform regulation of broadband platforms, whether it's cable, telephone, wireless, or whatever it is. So, in my opinion, at that point, the model is more the classic telecommunications regulatory model, where you have a federal set of rules and state PUCs or PSCs regulate that. And you have broadband franchises instead of video franchises. There are, and I do discuss at length, at some length in the paper, the role of local municipalities at that point in time, with I'm suggesting that their powers, they can have whatever residual powers there are, plus some other things. And I think there is still a role there, but not the classic cable regulator role. As to the other part of it with the PEG channels, if that was where you were going, I actually do address that extensively, because I felt that sort of the public interest aspect of what we're doing would reflect on that. So I address the issues of removal to digital tiers, channel slamming, loss of closed captioning, difficulty of finding it with remote, lower signal quality, channel latency, inability to record, cost of conversion from analog to digital, cost of interconnection with carriers, etc. So, and I suggest that mechanisms, and I suggest some alternatives, both combining the state and municipality, to make whole or keep whole the traditional capabilities of local access programmers, but not in the traditional way. And for better or worse, they too have to adapt to an IP-based world when you don't have any channels and everything's on the internet. So there's a lot of technology and other issues involved with that. Sorry for the long answer, but it was also a long question. So.
Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, Ted Hearn with Multi-Channel News. Does anyone in this book or does anyone on this panel want to discuss the possibility of migrating TV stations off of their spectrum, get them onto pay TV platforms in order to free up a couple hundred megahertz of prime spectrum for a better broadband in the wireless world?
We have spectrum panel is the next one, deals with spectrum issues. We'll have maybe, unless somebody wants to answer that here as well. In our second panel, we will be talking about spectrum policy. But if someone wants to pick this up now, that's fine. We still have a few minutes. Nope. They want to defer to the spectrum panel. Okay.
Well,
no, don't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to suggest that maybe one of the afternoon panelists just respond to the question.
Do you want to?
Otherwise, no.
Do you want to?
The question, John, is what do you think of the idea of migrating the broadcasters off of their prime spectrum and using that spectrum and making them go on pay TV platforms and using that prime spectrum for other, perhaps more valuable uses?
This is John Peha from Carnegie Mellon University. Okay.
Keep calling you that. It's certainly a powerful and important idea. The challenge you're going to have is that there are still large parts of this country where there's nothing to migrate to, where there aren't other vehicles for distributing content. That there is satellite, but satellite only, it does not throughout the country provide local content. It does in the big cities. And there is cable and broadband infrastructure, but again, that isn't everywhere. So I think these are good questions to ask, but we need to think more carefully about how to deal with that as a nationwide solution.
Thank you, John. Okay. Any more questions of this panel before we? Yes, please. Let's see.
I'm Art Brodsky from Public Knowledge, and my question is, the companies that are the main stumbling blocks to these are the incumbents. I mean, they've had years to build out, back in the old ISDN days, and never did that. They've had years to build out DSL and have never done that. So is it going to take massive corporate welfare to get them to do what they should be doing, or is there some other way around it?
Heather, please.
I think your point's very well taken. And I guess I would come back to the point Marvin was making, that I think largely getting more competition and technology neutral and industry neutral competition is really what it takes. When they're coming from the edge of Silicon Valley, there's all kinds of innovative outfits out there who have ideas about how to get cheaper broadband, whether it's covering inner cities with new technologies and frequency sharing, or innovative rural strategies, and they're just not allowed to get to the end user. So I think we need to use competitive incentives as far as possible, and targeted subsidies where they need them. And even the rural areas, although it's been pointed out that they tend to cost more, don't cost as much or don't need as much subsidy if you allow innovative companies, technologies, and service providers to get to those users. And so that's where I think the targeted subsidies that allow the little and innovative guys to come in, and the reducing the restrictions on interconnection, and we heard from Marvin also, I think, at the beginning about bundling, that really enforce the dominance of the incumbents, which are largely still monopolies or very limited oligopolies. And so we really need to take that on. We can't do this all by throwing money, although throwing some targeted money at some services or some areas may be part of the solution.
Yeah, after me.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I think Heather's point on support for new R&D in this area is absolutely essential. And your phrase corporate welfare is, I think, a very apt one. And I don't think anybody on this panel would agree that if we're going to invest a lot of funds on expanding broadband, that we want it to go right back into the pockets of the companies that have failed to deliver already. And this is where not only support for new research, but also support for very careful assessment and watching where the money is going and understanding what it is we're getting for our investment needs to be part of any policy plan.
Richard, would you as well? All right. Just two thoughts, and thank you for the question, Art. When it comes to the stimulus, the money we're investing from the stimulus package, that's essentially our public money investing in the kinds of networks we as a society want. And there should be conditions on it that are targeted, so we're not simply investing in the kinds of networks the carriers want, or simply lining the pockets of the carriers that have failed us. When it comes to regulation beyond the stimulus, my feeling is we shouldn't have to bribe these carriers at all. This is companies sometimes have incentives that counteract the incentives of society in general. So car companies would lobby against safety requirements, they'd lobby against gas mileage requirements, but they were wrong, and we imposed obligations on them for the good of society. When it comes to carriers who are fighting against competitive policies or net neutrality and openness conditions, they're simply wrong, and we should impose the right regulation on them for society. And we won the election, right? Obama's tech innovation agenda is pretty clearly on the side of competition and openness and broadband for all. And the people have chosen. They chose pretty resoundingly, and they choose every day on the internet. So my take is we shouldn't have to bribe these carriers. And I was told before my speech by a friend back there that I should make sure to quote Barack Obama's speech, and my speech would be fine. But to the carriers, they'll still make money in a world where society's better off. They'll still make money in a world where they're carrying bits to all Americans in an open, high bandwidth way. And I say to the carriers, we will lend a hand to you if you'll unclench your fist.
Yeah. This, I don't know who you're referring to when I said we won. Okay, let's just, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
I'm speaking as a law professor, not as
carried,
artist, yeah.
right, okay. Carried out to, what's in favor?
We those in favor of
we those in favor.
broadband.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, Beth, please.
Thanks. Beth McConnell with the Media and Democracy Coalition. I was wondering if you can put the $6 billion number in context. You know, we've heard that that's the figure in the stimulus package. In order to accomplish the things that you lay out in your papers, would $6 billion get us 0.1% the way, a quarter? Any sort of thought on that? You want to start?
Okay. I think that the way to think about the answer to that question actually comes back a bit to what our Brodsky question he raised, and that's how that money is used. If it's used as really effective leverage, then I think it could really make a difference. So if some of the funding, for example, that goes to pilot initiatives, which is being proposed, actually demonstrates how innovative technologies and services can be used for broadband, and that stimulates others to get out there, and the doors to do that are open in a competitive environment, it can have an impact far beyond whatever number finally is assigned in that bill. If the loan program, which is proposed through RUS, is really used as loans which have financial leverage as well as other incentives, again, that money could really have impact far beyond whatever final dollar amount is saved, is applied. And especially if we think about other initiatives, which is where I'm looking for an overall broadband strategy, and I'm hoping some of the people in this room afterwards can tell us it really does exist or it's on the way. Because I haven't seen it yet, because I think these are all very pieces of the puzzle. The rural health, or the health information system networks that HHS is working on, and which we did hear about in the inauguration speech, in terms of electronic medical records. I mean, that's a huge user community that using the networks and contributing and paying for access to those networks could leverage whatever funding is put in terms of broadband for health networks and other rural services and unserved areas tremendously beyond whatever dollar number is actually finally agreed upon.
$6 billion doesn't go that far from my perspective. Heather, I think, is correct in saying that it does depend on how you use it, and combining this investment with the opportunities that certain programs already provide might be the best way to see a near-term result. That said, I think investment in R&D that can improve technologies has to be a huge priority in this area. And then I also think that expanding the notion of siloed networks, this network is just for education, this network is just for health, that has to go away, especially with respect to rural areas. We need to think in terms of aggregating demand and in terms of building high-speed networks that are open to all the users that live in these less dense regions.
Again, it's not my particular expertise, but I read pretty widely in the field. And of course, it depends on what goal you're trying to achieve. If you want fiber optics to every home in the United States, that's really expensive. If you want some kind of access to something over 200 kilobits a second, you can probably do it for a lot less. But the numbers that I have seen range from about, for providing ubiquitous national broadband, between 60 billion and 200 billion, just to put some range of numbers on it.
Yeah, this is also slightly outside my personal expertise. The organization I used to work for, Free Press, we put forward a report called, I think, Down Payment on Our Digital Future, a stimulus plan that had $44 billion in there. Very ambitious, a menu of solutions. A few months ago, if you were to propose spending $44 billion, everyone would ask you where you'd find the money. Now people want you to spend more and more because there's stimulus. So we could have spent $44 billion. I mean, we were really successful there. But in terms of the $6 billion, I think what's really important is how it's spent, where it's targeted. We want to make sure we're investing in new investment that the carriers wouldn't have already undertaken, and that it targets rural areas, and that it creates as many jobs as possible in a way that's sort of in future-proof networks. So deploying fiber in rural areas that lack fiber, connecting people who don't have connections, rather than investing in upgrades in electronics that are made abroad, etc. Actually digging new lines would be what we'd want to subsidize, as well as scalable infrastructure.
Okay. In the second panel that will start in a few minutes, we will have John Piha of Carnegie Mellon University talk about the spectrum policy agenda, Rob Frieden of Penn State talk about the wireless industry, Catherine Montgomery of American University talk about the media policy agenda for youth and young audiences, and Ellen Goodman of Rutgers Law School Camden talk about public media. So we will take 5 minutes now. You can stretch in your seats, take a bite of your lunch, and we will replace the panels. Thank you.